So welcome everyone to the 2021 Lanegran Day lecture, which we are very excited about. I'm Bill Mosley. I'm a faculty member in the geography department here at Macalester. I have a few sort of general announcements and so on technical matters and some people to thank. But then our chair, Laura Smith, will say a few things about Lanegran Day and the person we're honoring. Then we'll have our speaker, Dr. Lindsay Naylor, speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So we're really looking forward to your questions at the end, so please note those. We are recording the talk portion here, but we will not be recording the Q&A session, and that's so other people can view this lecture at a later time. Pretty standard rules for being on Zoom. Unless you're asking a question, please mute. When we do the Q&A session, please raise a virtual hand. You can find that in the lower right with reactions. The hand raising is an option. And then I'll just call on people in the order that they raise their hands. I want to thank the coordinating committee for the talk. This includes students Jim Smith and Anisha Rajbandri. They have also organized a lunch for students tomorrow. So if you're interested in attending the lunch, please contact either of them to make sure you get the Zoom link. It's from 11:30 to 12:30 tomorrow. Also on the committee was Catherine Chang, Dan Trudeau, and Javier Hero Caron. Dan is also serving as our Zoom master today, so we thank him for technical support. And I also want to acknowledge our department coordinator, Laura Keegan, who has worked very hard behind the scenes on publicity and logistics. Lastly, I want to flag that while this is sort of the keynote address of the year, this is part of a series of 4 talks. And the next talk after this is by alum Kafui Ato on public transit and the right to the city on March 24th. So please stay tuned for that. I will now pass it over to our chair, Laura Smith.
Thanks, Bill. Welcome, everybody. It is so great to see you all. So many students, some alumni, some geography teachers and members of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education, some who fall into multiple categories. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. This is a great turnout. And this is the 5th annual David A. Lanegran Day. So a landmark for our event. And the celebration honors Professor David A. Lanegran, who is a Macalester grad from 1963 and has taught at Macalester since 1969. He retired in 2015, but of course has been teaching with us and still part of our community ever since as a professor emeritus. So this year marks 52 years for Dave at Macalester. And yay, Dave, everybody give it up for Dave. And he is here and members of his family are here and I've seen them in the matrix of faces here, so thanks. Dave's contributions are too numerous to be listed, but just know that he has been recognized with many awards, including some of the Lifetime Achievement Awards from our professional societies, like the George J. Miller Award, which is the highest honor given by the National Council for Geographic Education. And as a student of Dave's myself, one of the most impactful aspects of Dave's teaching was the way that he connected the classroom with the field and with the community. And upon his retirement, the Lanegran Geography Education Endowed Fund was established, and the mission of that fund is to dissolve the wall between the classroom and the broader world for geography students. So part of this has been the establishment of David A. Lanegran Days and inviting timely and exciting speakers like Dr. Naylor to give guest lectures, and then have social events and other activities around these days in early February. So that's a little bit of background about the event itself, and I'll turn it back to Professor Mosley to officially introduce Dr. Naylor. But welcome, Lindsay. We are very glad to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's really my honor and pleasure to be able to introduce this year's Lanegran Day speaker, Dr. Lindsay Naylor. I've been looking forward to meeting her for a long time. I first interacted with her when we wrote articles in a special issue in the Geographical Review on sort of a debate surrounding GMOs. And I wish she could be here in the flesh, but you know, Zoom is definitely better than nothing. She's an assistant professor and the graduate director at the Department of Geography and Spatial Science at the University of Delaware, a university now made famous because it's associated with Joe Biden. She earned her PhD in geography in 2014 from the University of Oregon. She also has a master's degree in international development from American University and a bachelor's degree in political science from Western Washington University. Her research interests are in international development, the geopolitics of food, and in improving equity and the sustainability of food systems. She's an extremely well-published author, and her publications have appeared in some of the top interdisciplinary and disciplinary journals in our field, including Political Geography, Environment and Planning A, Agriculture and Human Values, Local Environment, and the Geographical Review. And she also has published a book on fair trade, which is really the subject of this talk. And that was published by Minnesota Press, entitled Fair Trade Rebels, Coffee Production and the Struggles for Autonomy in Chiapas. So if you like what you hear today, please go out and purchase a copy of the book. So without further ado, Dr. Naylor, the floor is yours.
Wow, thank you so much, Bill. And again, it's my great honor to be here, and I'm glad to meet you even through Zoom as well. It was quite an honor to write alongside you in the GMO debates Geographical Review. I also am just incredibly honored to be the Lanegran Day speaker. I went ahead and as a intellectual and went and looked up the namesake, and it is truly an honor to be the name speaker, and I aspire to that level of commitment to geography and geography education. Thank you for your service. I am going to share my screen, so Dan, I hope, will help me out with that, so that you can see some really lovely fieldwork photos from back when we could travel that are related to the talk that I'm going to be giving today. So hopefully this will work out the way that we want it to. And if, Dan, if you could just unmute and let me know if you're seeing what I hope you're seeing.
Coming through really well, Lindsay, thanks.
Great, thank you so much. So one of the other reasons why I feel like I know some of you and the program really well is because you have a really great advocate on Twitter, Bill Mosley. And so I'm also on Twitter, and that's my Twitter handle. Today I'm going to talk about some themes from my recent book, which is, I am now proud to say, an award-winning book. It received the Julian Mingy Award from the Political Geography Specialty Group of the AAG. And as a result of that, the point in saying that is the University of Minnesota Press made available the first 2 chapters to be able to read online as a result of that award. So you don't have to go spend money if you want to just check it out. So I'm going to talk about some themes from this book, and it's generally focused on the production of food and coffee. And really, it's about multiplying knowledge. It's about how to live well. And as you can imagine, trying to distill a book that I've been working on for quite some time into a 1-hour talk, it's an unlikely task. And so I'm going to focus in on one chapter, the chapter I think that's the most hopeful actually in the book, which is largely talking about how fair trade isn't fair. And this chapter is concerned with what fair trade can do and the solidarity relations that are forged within economic exchanges. So Oh, I'm at the end. Glad we're recording that technical difficulty at the beginning. Let's try to go to the beginning. Here we are. So I'm going to start today by introducing you to a place and the people that I worked with while conducting this work. And then I'm going to put the cart just a little bit before the horse and talk about what I mean when I say fair trade and movement and what the idea of being in common is. And then I'm going to talk through some of the core questions of the book. And really the shape of the book is those 2, 3, and 4 you see. What is fair trade? Who is it for? And who gets to decide? And I'm going to use solidarity as a lens. And then I'll make a few concluding comments before we head into the Q&A, which is kind of the best part, to be honest. So this landscape of corn and coffee can tell us quite a lot about what's happening in what I call self-declared autonomous communities in the highlands of Chiapas, Mexico. It speaks to the enduring presence of corn in indigenous communities, and it's a really important daily foodstuff for those people. It also shows an income earning strategy, right? These treed areas that you see in the background are shade coffee plots where farmers grow coffee beans for the international marketplace. But if we take a closer look, this landscape can tell us more. At first glance, the coffee plots might look the same. However, some of these plots produce conventional beans and some fair trade certified beans. Some are cultivated by producers who are not attached to cooperatives, and some by farmers who are active members in producer cooperatives that are populated by social movement actors. And these actors, who I have termed fair rebels, are indigenous subsistence and coffee farmers who are in resistance, and they've declared autonomy from the state. So some days before I took this photo that you're seeing here, I was in a meeting with the leadership of the Fair Trade Coffee Cooperative that is largely populated by members of the Zapatista movement. And a farmer remarked to me, "Our coffee sells, and it sends a message that we are still here." This is a different narrative than the one that is presented, I think, as part of fair trade consumption. And I think it raises interesting questions about how fair trade is performed and practiced in the context of resistance. So this picture is not of the leadership of the cooperative, but of the Zapatista autonomous governance in the highland autonomous area of Oventique. And usually this is the point where I would be looking at all of you and we'd be in a room together and I'd ask how many of you heard of the Zapatistas, and I would get a show of hands. But right now I'm looking at my screen and hoping that you're thinking about the Zapatistas, and we can again talk about that in the Q&A. Because when I was in high school, the Zapatista uprising happened. And so most people had heard of them. And now I teach classes and I talk about the Zapatistas, and it's introductory material for a lot of folks, for a movement that is actually still relatively well-known worldwide and is very, very much in practice and alive. So an important thing to know about them is that they are a social movement that has a civilian and a military apparatus, and they are populated by indigenous Maya subsistence corn farmers. Again, they rose up against the Mexican state in 1994 to retain their right to land and the ability to be peasant farmers, or campesinos, campesinas. You'll notice that the government council I met with has their faces covered. This is pre-COVID. This is very common for the Zapatistas, who wear handkerchiefs or balaclavas to protect their identities. But most importantly, they began the practice of covering up their faces so that they could be seen. One member told me, "Without this mask, I'm just another Indian." And so they're a group of people in resistance, and they use coffee as one way of reminding people that they still exist and that they're still resisting the efforts of the state to remove them from the land and take away their way of life. And so the idea of their coffee selling, and it sends a message, is this is how we're communicating that we are still here and we are still fighting and we are still under siege. And that is especially true right now, based on reports that I'm hearing coming out of the Highlands. But this is one of the main focal points of the research that I'm going to present. But this is a not very attractive Venn diagram of the sort of larger themes of the project that shape the writing that I did for this book. And in this work, I asked questions about how farmers who are linked to anti-capitalist movements who have declared autonomy from the state and who are using the fair trade marketplace as a way to maintain their livelihoods and the broader movements that they're connected to. And really, what does that mean for solidarity work and how to work with people who are living in very, very different social, economic, and political conditions than we are, for example? And so these are just a few keywords that I think this is a potentially problematic Venn diagram that we can talk about, but because it divides the producer and consumer, which is something that I try to disrupt in this work as well. But the theory here is to see where they meet and to look at the desires to produce food for their families and their communities through subsistence production, and then have also our consumers and try to live dignified livelihoods while producing for the market. And so all of this contributes to the practice of autonomy and resistance for these rebel indigenous people. So I conducted research in the highlands of Chiapas, Mexico, in these rebel autonomous communities. I began this work back in 2008, and as we were talking about on the call, I went back in December when my book had been published to bring it to the community. So I was in Chiapas in December of 2019. I think I said 2018 earlier, and that is incorrect because my book had not been published then, but I was definitely back there in December of 2019. And so what you need to know about Chiapas is that it's the southernmost state in Mexico, and it shares a border with Guatemala, right? And you can see the Gulf of Mexico and the southern border of Texas in these lovely maps that were made for me by Nathan Thayer, who is a PhD student who works with me in the department. And these are published in my book, which is very exciting. And so, looking to the south, the map terminates looking into Central America, where that migrant caravan last year had traveled from. Chiapas is frequently treated by the state and by many scholars as a problem. This is Pocket. He's joining us and blocking my view of my notes. And it's often talked about in academic and state-produced accounts as the most impoverished state in Mexico. So Chiapas is about the same size as the state of Oregon in the United States. And I concentrated my time in the official municipality of Chenjaló, which you can see from the lower map, where the dots are. Those are principal towns and cities in that official municipality. Chiapas has a majority population of indigenous peoples, and many of them are subsistence corn farmers, meaning that they grow enough food in general to feed their families and communities instead of buying their food. The highlands also supports other food production and has the right climate for coffee. They are the site of resistance and self-declared autonomy. And as you enter Zapatista territories in particular, you see signs like the one pictured here that I took that says that the highlands are, again, a site of resistance, and you have entered rebel Zapatista territory where the people rule. Chiapas is, I think, a particularly interesting location to look at issues of food and agriculture because of its turbulent land reform history. This image is a mural from one of the autonomous areas. And again, you see the balaclava motif, but this time it's represented through corn. And again, corn remains an incredibly important crop in the region. And because of this, having access to land and resources is an essential element of indigenous resistance, and especially since the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s. And many scholars agree that land reform was exceptionally contentious and very poorly executed in this state. And so at the time of the North American Free Trade Agreement being signed in the early 90s, which there's a longer history there where land reform efforts were effectively canceled, there were still thousands of petitions by small farmers trying to gain access to land that had been in contention for decades, and they were still unresolved. And so one of the things I want to point out about this is that this was a highly racialized process that showed that land was largely owned by non-Indigenous groups, and petitions for access to land were primarily being made by Indigenous Maya people in Chiapas. And so the history for struggles for land ties to early Indigenous organizing in the state and demands for self-determination. The ability, or the inability rather, to obtain access to land and income in the 1970s led to organizing in Chiapas. And so as communal land rights were eroded and constitutionally guaranteed land reform was constitutionally, no longer constitutionally valid, in the early 1990s, the protests of these Indigenous-led groups became louder and eventually led to the uprising in 1994. And this was an uprising for Indigenous rights, livelihood, land, and autonomy. So the research I conducted was with members of two different resistance movements that formed out of these experiences, Las Abejas and the Zapatistas. And I'm not going to take a long detour into their histories. That's a totally different talk. But they did have negotiations with the government in the 1990s that were very important for Indigenous rights and autonomy. And so I want to highlight just a few of those moments so that you can have some context for the ultimate declaration of autonomy that happened and why I term these areas self-declared autonomous areas. And so in 1992, a pacifist Christian group, the Civil Society of the Bees, which again I'll refer to as Las Abejas, which means the bees, was formed in the highlands to spearhead women's rights to land ownership. In 1994, the armed uprising of the Zapatistas happened, and that made visible the demands of Indigenous farmers in Chiapas for the first time on a global scale. So this photo that you're looking at here is of two coffee cooperative members. They're farmers. They're also part of the leadership of the coffee cooperative that is largely populated by folks from Las Abejas. And these two groups are in solidarity with one another. And they live and work alongside each other, and also other groups who are in opposition to their movement. Since the mid-1990s, the government has waged a low-intensity war against these groups. And at the height of violence in 1997, 45 men, women, and children who were part of Las Abejas were gunned down at a Mass for Peace, an incident that's now known as the Massacre of Action. As a result of this violence, their groups and the government's unwillingness to recognize the right to their self-determination in the early 2000s, both of these groups shifted their pursuit of autonomy from petitioning the state for rights to effectively ignoring the state. And this change was a meaningful one, as they created a de facto separation from the state, but are now able to, in essence, move on and build concrete alternatives at the same time. So they don't participate in state-sponsored politics. They don't receive any funds, subsidies, healthcare, or educational services, or any other support from the state. And they remain under a threat of military and paramilitary violence even today. And the photos that you're seeing here are, one is one that was featured in La Granada, where women from Las Abejas were actively using their bodies to prevent the military from coming into their communities. And then the photos of the protest are photos that I took in 2012. And this is a protest for peace and public censoring of the state for not prosecuting the people who perpetrated the massacre. And so the response of these movements to this violence came in the form of cooperative governance, education, healthcare, and economic activities they made for themselves, where the state was not supporting them. And so farmers in the highlands have been producing coffee for some time, since the 1960s and before, but following the massacre at Acteal, many of these producers organized themselves into new coffee cooperatives as part of their resistance. And these cooperatives pooled whatever resources they had in order to support each other and to reach out to other networks of support outside of Mexico. And so out of crisis and violence emerged new forms and broader networks of support. And when discussing this period with a member of the leadership of Las Abejas, their cooperative is called Maya Vinique, which in Tzotzil or translates to English as Mayan man. This history was discussed in the context of solidarity connections. So this particular member said to me, cooperatives are usually created in the context of a certain future possibility, of a certain hope. The cooperative of Maya Vinique was founded when there was no hope. And a lot of it had to do with overcoming trauma. And since there's been great support, and maybe Maya Vinique without the fair trade premium might not be able to have such stable relationships. And the photos that you're looking at here are of the bodega in the highlands. So this is like 2.5 hours out of the former colonial seat of San Cristobal de las Casas, in very, very windy road conditions that I would travel to and work with farmers at the bodega. This is where they store their coffee and people deliver their coffee. And then the lower photo is of their roasting facility in the city. One of the things about Maya Vinique is that they have had enough success, and unlike other coffee producing countries, a lot of the coffee that's produced in Mexico actually stays in Mexico. It's not all exported. And so it's roasted. The non-export quality beans are roasted and sold at a cafe in the city, which signals an enormous success through their solidarity work. So while the folks that I work with in Chiapas are coffee farmers, they use the sale of their coffee as part of a larger livelihood strategy and as a component of their resistance. This, you might be able to see my feet in the bottom of this photo, but this is me hanging out with the 4 people who have salaried positions or paid positions with the coffee cooperative and who do the coffee intake. They are pictured here mending bags, which they were absolutely not interested in me having help. They did not think that I would be able to sew. It was a very funny conversation. So my Havanique, similar to their Zapatista counterparts, maintain solidarity relations. Of course, there are those connections that exist between these movements within and beyond Mexico, but for campesinos and campesinas and resistance in the highlands, it's on coffee that their long-term relationships of exchange are predicated. And so for our purposes today, I want to discuss solidarity in coffee exchanges and how this might create possibilities of what I'm calling being in common. So producing under the fair trade label assists with establishing important ties to buyers in the United States that not only allow for secure sources of income, but also a critical space for information sharing and support for coffee producing communities. And these relations, I argue in my book, are a critical component of the practice of solidarity in the Highlands. And so the data that I'm drawing on here comes from, again, over a decade of work in fair trade and on fair trade and in fair trade producing communities, and multiple trips over a few years to the Highlands of Chiapas, where I conducted interviews, participant observation, and I participated in a number of events with the different coffee cooperatives that I worked with and their members. And those events ranged from festivals and celebrations to fair trade certification audits and other certification meetings and other things of that character, which I can speak to more if people want to talk about methods. But if we're going to think about how fair trade solidarity relations may offer the possibility for being in common, I first want to consider what being in common might mean. Like if we're thinking about fair trade in movement, which is something that I'll talk about in more depth later, I want to think about how it relates to the way that we practice economic exchanges. And so in my research, I draw quite a bit from the work of diverse economic thinking that was spearheaded by the writing duo J.K. Gibson Graham. And very basically, the crux of these ideas is that we should multiply our understandings of economic exchange beyond the universalizing idea that the economy means capitalism, right? It is a feminist call to value labor differently and to reconsider work and what property means, and to think differently about what business is and what finance is. And as a part of this work, they encourage scholars to consider many economic subjectivities, and so in so doing, the possibilities of being in common. And so this iceberg image is something that has become very popular in this particular research network. And I hope it's doing the work for you visually for what I'm talking about, in that we tend to think about economic activity as being that bit that's above the waterline, right? So we present ourselves as laborers in the market and we get paid. And then we buy stuff and then we continue that cycle. But there's a wealth of labor that doesn't directly contribute to, for example, GDP, or that might not be paid, or might be compensated in different ways, that because it can't be counted, isn't counted. And this idea of thinking about labor and care and work, for example, as multiple, disrupts that a little bit and shows that we really need to value people's labor differently. Being in common encompasses an ethical responsibility for being together, for existing together, and for occupying the same spaces, from the scale of the body to the global scale. And this is not just among humans, but also our Earth others. So such relations are built from connective ontologies, or ways of being, creating trusting relationships. So if we think of an example, we might think about Michigan, right? We can think about what's happening in Flint right now. What decisions are being made by the community to gain access to clean water and the right to live well, and also creating mutually supportive sets of connections around distributing water at the community and household level. And people in the community are acting together then to lift each other up and to petition for change in a system that really doesn't appear to value them. And so being in common is a hopeful space that opens up the possibilities for a politics of belonging and mutual aid. And so, and because it's not enough to promote economic well-being we have to also consider social and ecological well-being at the same time. And so to do that, we also have to be attentive to the political practices that shape it. So to be in common requires more from us as citizens of the same planet. And a piece of this puzzle is tied to economic exchanges and the outcomes of our decision-making and our knowledge production as participants in these exchanges. And so how does, or does fair trade fit into these ideas? How do coffee exchanges between different groups and places factor in? And so that's where I get to the major questions of the book. And so the very first is, what is fair trade? And I think fair trade's become common enough that you see the mark in the grocery store. It's not as obscure maybe as it was in the 80s and 90s. But the key way that I examine this puzzle is by asking questions about economic exchanges under this certification system. So for our purposes today, I want to think about fair trade as being multiple, but the way we often think about it is in a bifurcated way, where we think about it as a movement and a market. And as a market, one that seeks to reduce the number of actors in a commodity chain, thereby putting more cash into the hands of people who are producing the commodities, in this case, coffee. It's also an agreement between third-party certifiers and producers regarding social, economic, and environmental standards. For example, reducing child labor in production, or guaranteeing a minimum price, or producing without harmful chemicals. And the images that I have here are just a smattering of different third-party certification, either labels or the ways that they advertise how the coffee commodity chain changes, and some of the standards that they're thinking about when they evaluate cooperatives, because the onus is on the cooperatives to hold up these standards. And a lot of these symbols look fairly similar. It's a fun project I do with my food justice class to identify the difference behind the labels. But the first fairly traded goods were certified in the late 1980s. So in 1998, the label of Max Havelaar was co-developed between a Dutch international development organization called Max Havelaar and Mexican coffee growers. And since that time, it's come to be a multi-billion-dollar industry with multiple labels certifying multiple commodities such as coffee, tea, bananas, but also composite products like ice cream and chocolate, and now even textiles and other handmade crafts, as you can see in this advertisement of this family, where this was something that was a competition on Twitter for people to try to have as many fair trade goods in their photo as they could during Fair Trade Month, which is in October. And so it's expanded quite significantly. So these images here are not comprehensive, but they do show a variety of the fair trade goods that are available. And again, this picture, I think, starts to hint a little bit at what I want to talk about more today, and asking who fair trade is for. Because this image, again, is meant to show you all the things you can have in your home that are fairly traded in what looks like a relatively affluent lifestyle, where a white family gets to enjoy these kinds of goods, which are relatively cost prohibitive for most people. And so with the increased role of certification, a number of scholars and practitioners are questioning how far we've moved from the foundations, the original foundations of solidarity that fair trade was founded on. And so there's some debate about what fair trade is, whether it's a movement or a market. And although there are many certifiers and labels now to choose from, in 2011, fair trade certification entered a moment of divisiveness, where the Fair Trade Labeling Organization broke apart from with a divorce from, effectively a divorce from Fair Trade USA and Fair Trade International. And please excuse my distraction, as the faculty on the call know, my cats are hanging out with us today, and right now they're having a particularly interesting struggle to the right of me. And so, again, I'm not going to go into any great depth about this split or how these certifiers differ, but the main reason for the departure of what is now Fair Trade USA from the Fair Trade Labeling Organization, which is now called Fair Trade International, was because they wanted to certify plantations, which was something that small farmers had been arguing against for a number of years, because they were concerned that it would dilute the standards, and the small coffee producers were especially concerned because plantations would flood the market and undercut their production. Because one of the things that we don't talk very much about when we talk about fair trade is that even if you're selling on the fair trade market, you might not sell all of your product at the fair trade price. And so small farmers were concerned that their piece of the pie would get smaller and smaller. And so all of this led the broader fair trade community to ask who owns fair trade. And this is a cartoon that was produced by John Klassner and for Equal Exchange, which is a prominent ethical economic group that certifies fair trade. And so who owns it? Is it the farmers? Is it alternative trade organizations? Is it these large third-party certifiers who have now turned into a multi-billion-dollar industry? And so I want to think a little bit about who is it for? Because many times when fair trade products are advertised, we hear that by buying fair trade, consumers and producers connect. It's a very powerful idea, and it's supported by certifiers and proponents of fair trade markets, but it's something that I actually want to disrupt today. I'm not trying to suggest it's not a great idea, right? To know your farmer and to really be able to connect with the production and the process and things of that character. It's built on the possibilities of being in common, but fair trade exchanges are really uneven. And the idea that we can simply buy our way to a better world is not very realistic. And the fair trade market is effectively built on asymmetrical relations that requires there to be a marginalized producer in order for fair trade to exist. And a fair trade purchase is considered ethical and a way to demonstrate solidarity, but how does that function as a component of economic exchange? Are consumers buying their way into solidarity through ethically minded purchases? Are consumers paying the coffee importers and roasters to perform solidarity on their behalf? And so for me, such questions raise others about the social spaces that are created through fair trade exchanges, interdependence in economic exchanges, and really what solidarity can or does mean in this context. And the images that you're seeing here are advertising images from Fair Trade USA. And you'll notice that there is a similarity in these images, and that there is a difference in who is consuming and who is producing. So historically, solidarity movements in the Americas were tied to awareness campaigns and protesting South and Central American dictatorships and military regimes in the 1960s and 1980s, and also to supporting historic grievances regarding land tenure and social inequities in the region. So such groups attempted to gain or give an international voice to those whose voices were being stifled in their own countries. So a number of solidarity movements formed in the context of this resistance and struggle in places such as Southern Mexico and Colombia. And again, solidarity can be practiced in a number of different ways, through boycotts, through sit-ins, demonstrations, being present, accompaniment, information dissemination. And more recently, it's been articulated as something that people can deploy on behalf of others through their purchasing power. And so solidarity, again, being characterized in a number of different ways, starts to get a little bit sticky in that when we start to tie it to economic exchange, there's a problem of creating these subject-object relationships where, or the problem of speaking for others, as Linda Alcoff has published on, or taking the role of the helper, as Sarah Koopman has published. There's a particular whiteness to helper forms of solidarity that really entrench the help offered or provided into long-standing unequal race relations that really end up positioning white bodies as helping bodies and brown bodies as recipient bodies. So solidarity becomes a real slippery concept, which some define as acting on behalf of others, or as a political struggle, or working for social change. But at its foundation, it's working to both make visible and mitigate oppression. So what I suggest here is that solidarity doesn't mean the same thing to all actors within the certified fair trade movement. And that network and broader research and scholarship on fair trade, which focuses on these consumer producer linkages and ethical purchasing, really falls into critiques of what's been termed helper solidarity. And this helper solidarity is something that I discuss as the buy and let live of sort of the mentality of fair trade consumerism, which I argue is not mutual aid or interdependence, but is instead dependent on the continued existence of disparity. Again, for fair trade to exist, someone has to be being marginalized. And so fair trade exchanges being predicated on these unequal relations between what I've published on talking about a consuming North and a producing South, effectively calls on an ethical commitment by a wealthy consumer to purchase commodities from an impoverished producer. And as part of their participation, those who are purchasing coffee are folded into an imaginary producer-consumer community, whereby their perceived participation takes place not only through imbibing coffee, but also through their purchase, improving the daily life of this extended community of producers, which now reaches beyond an individual producer family through their homes and across their fields to distant others. And this image that you're seeing here is one that I pulled during Fair Trade Month, I think it's probably been about 5 years now, but for those of us that can read the small print, it says your everyday purchase can improve an entire community's day-to-day lives. So just by buying the thing that you consume maybe on a daily basis, not all of us are coffee drinkers, the third-party certifier is saying you're making this massive change just by doing what you normally do. So the reality of how fair trade exchanges happen disrupts, I think, this imagined community that's described in fair trade marketing campaigns. And again, they're promoting this connection between these individual coffee producers and coffee growers or other fair trade products. As you can see, rice is pictured here. Consumer practices of purchasing and ethical informed decision-making fall on the margins of fair trade networks. Consumers aren't dependent on any particular producer or product for their coffee or their ethical purchasing. Their performance is bound to purchasing a gourmet or luxury item that could come from any number of possible producers. When discussing what campesinos or campesinas thought of fair trade, we often talked about price. In 2012, one campesino remarked to me, "This year it's a really low price. If we need to buy something at the store or medicine, the price keeps increasing, but the coffee price doesn't go up." In the fair trade exchange imaginary, one group is using their accumulated wealth to facilitate the life and livelihood of another group. The purchase of coffee at a minimum or premium price tends not to create a financial strain on the part of the purchaser, but the greater share of income being retained by the producer allows them to stand in place financially. So we hear a lot about getting money into the hands of farmers, but even research that's being done now by third-party certifiers as they look inward is demonstrating that they're not improving people's livelihoods. They're keeping them from slipping into further poverty, which is important, right? We don't want people slipping further and further, but it's not the economic promise that is advertised through our ethical purchasing. And so if being in common is premised on seeking possibilities for building equity and interdependence, then the asymmetrical relations of fair trade exchanges really don't appear to fit. And so for me, this result doesn't, after a decade or so of work, this doesn't come as a particular surprise, but for me, it's instead consistent with seeking to understand economic exchange in its multiplicity and fluidity, or how possibilities may be opened up or not for overcoming uneven relations. So how can we reconcile helper forms of solidarity, which require very little action from coffee purchasers, with the possibilities of being in common, which require interdependence and mutual aid? What I want to suggest here is that the asymmetrical or imbalanced relations between the individuals making an ethical commitment to support fair trade certification through coffee purchases and those who are cultivating coffee and negotiating its sale as part of fair trade certified marketplace point to struggles and to uncertainties and ambivalences and disappointments, to be fair. And so at the same time, these relations also demonstrate multiple meanings and understandings of being in common. But I want to ask here, how then do producers fit into this messy reality? I started us out in the highlands of Chiapas, and it's rather significant that in order to tell this story, I had to zoom out quite a bit to talk about the messy entanglements of fair trade certification and who it's for. And at this point, it would seem that the producers are almost an afterthought. And simultaneously, though I argue that producers push back on these homogenizing tropes and helper forms of solidarity by appropriating and deploying fair trade to suit their purposes. And that's why well, besides being a geographer and starting in place, that's a really important piece of starting in place, because these folks don't identify as fair trade coffee farmers. They identify as corn farmers, and fair trade is something that helps facilitate that. And in that pushing back that these farmers are doing, I think this is a really big piece of who gets to decide what fair trade is. And so the question of who gets to decide is a core piece of the conversation that I have in my book. So we often hear about the fair trade movement, and it's here that I want to introduce the idea of fair trade in movement. As I introduced in the beginning, the producers who I worked with are part of these social movements that are in resistance and declared autonomy from the state. They are at the foundation, their primary goal is to live dignified livelihoods as indigenous subsistence farmers. And in this way, they push back on what fair trade is and how they can use it. And for me, this lies at the crux of fair trade and movement. In identifying fair trade and movement, what I'm trying to imply is a momentum, and in particular, a momentum for change. The idea of cultivating fairer forms of exchange seems to have kind of been stalled by universalizing ideas of development, which place people on a similar trajectory towards high mass consumption that's based in Washington consensus thinking. And these universals are mired in a contradiction as they're deployed to fix people, both in time and space, which effectively renders them static on this trajectory, even as they're exploited to fuel the consumption desires of others elsewhere. So what do these communities actually look like? How do they engage with fair trade? And how do their relations of production actually foster possibilities of being in common? So over 3 years and several cups of coffee, I learned that fair trade agricultural production is just a part of daily life, another piece of an agricultural strategy, which is not unusual for campesinos and campesinas and peasants worldwide. But the connection to fair trade is part of a broader commitment to struggling for autonomy. So in an interview with one of the campesinos who I worked with, he said, we're coffee farmers who became organized so we could work on our own and better, and so we could feed our families. Fair trade's an afterthought, and followed by the importance of the cooperative. One producer expressed to me while we were discussing the fair trade price for coffee that year again, he said, through our cooperative, we sell the coffee, and through them, we get a better price, the best price. And if there's a drop in the price before, it would hurt our families, before we can help our families. And so ultimately, there's this reflection on the ability to stand in place. Simultaneously, they reflect on the fair trade price not being fair, not being a living wage, and really the sorrow about not having enough land to produce corn and having to purchase it prior to the harvest, something that Chris Bacon and others have published on, and they call the lean months. Fair trade doesn't fully insulate campesinos, campesinas in resistance from the vicissitudes of everyday life. As one campesino remarked, you can't eat coffee, right? But pushing back against this narrative of a marginalized producer, we can look to another comment from a different producer. It's a future that we construct to counter the deconstruction, and it's a way to get respect. And so in this case, this farmer is explaining how the market seeks to make them invisible, but they push back through fair trade to be seen and recognized and to get respect for their labor and production practices. And they do that in a number of different ways. One of the key ways that this takes place is through the connection to their cooperative. So the farmer brings their coffee to the cooperative, but also, through the cooperative's connections to coffee roasters in the United States. So the connection to the cooperative is highlighted by campesinos and campesinas often, especially in the aftermath of the height of violence in the highlands. So following their experience under threat, many of them were refugees and had to flee the highlands. And one campesino, campesina said, we were a displaced people, my family, between 1998 and 2001 because of the violence, but we came back to our place and we joined our organization and began producing again. So the principles in solidarity, connection of fair trade doesn't really factor into the importance of the cooperative for the majority of the farmers that I spoke with, but the existence of the cooperative is the main concern for the producers. Another comment was that our organization is good because even though the price changes, we have our price of Maya Vinique, and we have the cooperative and the organization, which is better, and it's much better than the coyotes. And just for the uninitiated, coyotes are the intermediaries that pay very low prices and are well known to be extremely unfair in the payments that they give to folks. And it is largely people who aren't associated with cooperatives who sell to coyotes. Okay, we're coming up on time here. So I discussed coffee production under fair trade certification with folks, and under the fair trade certification, it often came to having somewhere to sell. And the coffee cooperatives have solidarity relationships with their buying cooperatives and their member roasters, but for the most part, the campesinos and campesinas have a relationship to their cooperatives and the consistency. So right now, sitting on my kitchen counter is a bag of coffee that says Maya Vinique. I purchased this coffee in the United States from a coffee roaster called Higher Grounds. When I go to their website, I can find this coffee produced by the people who I worked with in the Highlands. Their coffee isn't blended into obscurity. Instead, it is sold with their story, the story of the struggle for autonomy and the violence of the state. And I offer this as one example. Higher Grounds didn't exist before the Massacre of Action. Rather, the founding members visited the Highlands as part of solidarity organizing, and at the suggestion of the coffee farmers, returned home and started a coffee roasting company explicitly so they could make people in the United States aware of the struggle in Chiapas through the sale of the coffee. So in an interview with the founder of Higher Grounds, which I did only just a couple of years ago, reflecting on fieldwork, they explain the power of telling these stories. Right now, he said, right now we live in the moment in time where storytelling that ties back to farmers is a huge piece. The inspiration, the struggle, it's something that people will be riveted by, but there's so much more that we need to be doing to tell an authentic story. And I think this is where the opportunity lies, but only where you have authentic relationships. And so I think that these ideas suggest that we have to ask questions about the type of economic exchanges we want to participate in, about how we want to bring meaning or not to our economic practices and performances. The economic exchange that prioritizes life and livelihood over wealth and accumulation is more likely the one between the coffee roasters and the coffee growing cooperatives. These groups have established relationships, they co-create knowledge, they tell stories when possible to travel, they share food, and of course, coffee. And they provide the possibility of what we could be moving towards with fair trade and movement and the possibilities of being in common. And as the producer cooperatives struggle to remain visible under threat, sharing their stories through the sale of coffee is one strategy. And so as coffee roasters seek to participate in a movement for change and justice, they also build relationships and rereading the landscape for economic difference really, I think, could work towards reframing the geographical imaginaries we have of place. And it means not just thinking about these places as where coffee is produced, but about them as places of resilience and where people undertake multiple economic activities, from the sale of coffee and subsistence farming to temporary paid labor and barter exchange. It's about seeing these places not as those that need help, but as those that are striving to exist and live well. And this is just one last final image. In the spirit of solidarity, the Zapatista coffee cooperatives pooled all of their coffee and sent it to the United States to help support efforts to resist the construction of the border wall during the presidency of the 45th American president. All right, thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so I can see the matrix of faces again.